So there's a question sort of I've been thinking about, as I've been doing a lot of the research on getting older and stronger, and that is, when does age actually start? Not the number of candles on the birthday cake, um, not the moment someone first calls you sir or ma'am. The biological moment is when your body begins to sort of slow slide from healthy to, we'll just call it, a compromised position. When does that actually begin? For most of, I would say, my adult life, I assumed it was somewhere way out in the future when I was younger, like 60s, right? Like 60s was really old when I was young. That's when people, start getting diagnosed with, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and real, independence really starts to become a concern. 60 seemed like sort of that divergent point for me. Um, but I was wrong. So, as we started looking at some of this peer-reviewed research, and I'll walk through a little bit of that today. The biological divergence really between your health span and your lifespan begins much earlier um, than sort of those visible symptoms suggest. And Americans specifically now have sort of the worst outcome, of any country, on Earth. Um, and one of the most important studies that was done on this was published by the Mayo Clinic. It analyzed data from 183 World Health Organization members, states, covering several decades of sort of longitudinal follow up. And they quantified something called a health span lifespan gap, the number of years that the person sort of lived in a sort of compromised position before dying. And the findings were pretty dramatic. The global average was about 9.6 years. That means the average human on Earth spends nearly almost a decade, we'll say, sort of dying poorly before they actually pass. And this gap has grown 13% from 8.5 years in 2000 to 9.6 years in 2019. So the gap is actually growing, which is a little contradictory than a contrarian point of view there would think it would be going the other way. Um, but the United States, when they looked at the data, the Americans, you know, we Americans spend 12.4 years in a somewhat compromised position before dying. And that's the largest gap sort of any of the countries studied. Second worst was Australia at 12.1. New Zealand was, I think, 11.8, somewhere around there. And the United Kingdom stood around 11.3. These are all, wealthy countries and with advanced medical systems. It's not a poverty problem. It's a lifestyle problem. And in the countries, that we just discussed, they can most afford to fix it if they so choose. Um, and so, that sort of brings us to why, um, we've got the getting an older and stronger community is to help with this gap. The White Wall study, this is another study, White Wall 2 study, was a 13-year, I would say, warning system that came out of that study. And what that study found was, the Mayo Clinic study we just discussed sort of quantified the size of the gap, but it did not answer, when that divergence, when did it actually start occurring? So the White Wall 2 study started around 1985, had around little over 10,000 civil servant workers, British. This was done over in Britain. And they range in age from say 35 to 55, that age, and that's been running since 85, so about 40 years. They took blood samples every few years, cognitive assessments, and so forth. So it was a pretty deep, data set. Um, and one of the researchers, Adam Tabak, Tabak, basically stated they really asked, one question, um, of this data set, and they looked at people that were, that had got diagnosed with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, at age 60, and then when did their sort of metabolic system actually start showing, um, start sort of deteriorating? When did they start seeing that? And it was quite extraordinary because when they looked at it, blood glucose regulation began sort of a measurable deterioration 13 years um, before any eventual diagnosis. So that insulin sensitivity, uh, began to decline. Insulin secretion began deteriorating. All this in their sort of mid to late 40s, and those people would eventually be diagnosed late 50s, early 60s with type 2 diabetes. Um, the disease sort of, we should say, shows up clinically at 60, but it's been developing since they were, 47 for 13 years. And so that number sort of changed a little bit, how I think about aging. Um, if you're 45, you feel fine. Your body may uh, already be 3 to 5 years into that trajectory. And the symptoms come at the end of a sort of a long biological process. So, if you look at combining the Mayo Clinic gap size and the Whitehall 2 timing, here's sort of the complete picture. Ages 40 to 50, sort of subclinical divergence begins. Blood glucose, insulin sensitivity, and muscle mass all start, sort of measurable decline. No symptoms yet. This is sort of what I'll call your intervention window. And that's sort of the intervention window. That's the window I got very involved with: strength training, nutrition, mindset, and all that. Age 50 to 60, that metabolic dysfunction sort of begins. And that subclinical divergence that you had in your 40 to 50s now starts to sort of accelerate in your 50s and 60s. That type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers decline, cardiovascular changes sort of become measurable, right? High blood pressure, automatic statin given to you. Body composition shifts, right? You're losing that muscle mass. Still fully modifiable at this point, but the interventions, will require a little more effort. Ages 60 to 70, clinical disease emerges: type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, arthritis, cognitive changes, all become sort of diagnosable. Interventions still work at this point, but more effort, and you'll get sort of smaller gains at this point. And then, ages 70 to 80, multi-morbidity compound, sort of compounds. Multiple chronic conditions coexist. Sarcopenia is advanced. Cognitive decline, and that accelerates. And this is where that sort of 12.4 year gap becomes very, how should I say, very visible in your daily life, right? We see it. You may see it in your grandparents now, right, where they don't have their independence. They're on several medications, and all that, right? So all that is preventable. Okay, it's not inevitable. Okay, so we just got to do things in your 40s and in your 50s in that intervention window. The getting older and stronger sort of system that we use is the UCANT system. That exists to sort of close that health span lifespan gap for adults over 50. every pillar of the UCAN system sort of directly addresses one of the biological mechanisms that's driving that gap. Um, we'll review it right now. Pillar U is that unapologetically forgiving. Chronic stress, self-criticism, directly accelerate that aging trajectory. Elevated cortisol from self-criticism accelerates the metabolic dysfunction as documented in the White Wall study. And self-compassion is really the biological anti-aging intervention, having that self-compassion for yourself. Pillar C, consistency. The Whitehall 2 data shows that divergent sort of is over decades, right? So, meaning consistently over the years is what actually matters. Someone who trains hard, over 3 months and quits will not affect that trajectory at all, right? It's the consistency is the only intervention that sort of operates on the time scale that biology cares about. Pillar A, aligned mind and body. Different organs are at, sort of age at different rates. The person whose brain ages faster, develops dementia first. The person whose muscle ages faster loses independence first. Alignment is really important. It means it pays attention for signals from every system. So we make sure the mind and the body and doing everything to make sure we're aligned there. And then pillar N, never give up, right? The gap is not inevitable, but reversing it takes decades of consistent action. The people who close the gap, are the ones who kept showing up long after most people would have really given up. All right, so that UCAN system can help you close that gap. The gap is caused by non-communicable disease. Non-communicable diseases are caused by modifiable lifestyle factors. Therefore, the gap is modifiable. And here's what the peer review evidence sort of says works. One, resistance training. We've talked this 2 to 3 times per week. Progressive loading over months and years is what, any resistance training beats no resistance training. But, this alone is stronger evidence that any medication currently, prescribed as you decline in age, right? Resistance training is better than any medication. Progressive overload is important. As we stated, I like heavy lifting. You can also lift, moderate loads closer to failure, higher reps. I choose heavy lifting. It's whatever works for you. 2, adequate protein. We've had a lot of discussions on, what that is. 1 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, distributed across 3 to 4 meals, maybe even 5 meals. All right. And this is evidence-based target for adults over 50. All right. So get that protein, that adequate protein over 4 to 5 meals. Can only do about 40 grams. Anything above that, the evidence gets shaky as far as what you can actually absorb and use. But spread that out, whole foods, and you could supplement with whey protein isolate. But adequate protein is key. 3, whole food eating pattern. Fermented foods, which is right here. I got kombucha, right? I got kombucha and right several. That's where one of the things I'm doing. I'm trying to increase my fermented foods. So get that whole food pattern with fermented foods and diverse fiber. 4, sleep optimization, 7 to 9 hours per night, quality sleep. 5, stress management. And you can't underestimate the social connection, because chronic stress and isolation drives sort of drives the, I would say, non-communicable disease burden. So community is important in making that connection. If you don't have one, get over at Getting Older and Stronger face group community, but establish a community. And then 6 is the, I'll say systemic view. Everything, that we just discussed works better when combined, okay? Training works better when protein intake is adequate. Sleep works better when training has produced physical fatigue. Community reduces the stress that drives inflammation. So all those things is a system. And if we've got several blog posts that sort of go through each of those systems, and those are currently on the website. So, get to that research. And specifically, this is in blog post 15 with all 10 citations and the practical response that we've just sort of gone through. That's all at gettingolderandStronger.com. Drop me a comment telling, if you're, sort of committing to that change today. I read all the comments personally. Subscribe and follow, and for more evidence-based information that you can use to get older and stronger. And remember, it's just information until you use it. Then it becomes experience and knowledge.